For some stories, the plot, it doesn't really matter. A lot of folks on the internet will argue that the plot is the most crucial element to a story's success. And in fairness, they're often not wrong. For a lot of people, James Cameron's Avatar disappointed them back in 2009 because the plot was derivative. And it was very derivative. Cameron spent years planning the world of Pandora, and his script, while also finely crafted by his own standards, ultimately served more as an excuse to explore the spectacle of the world he made. An avenue through which you can see the ins and mechanics of how everything worked.
For the 4 Avatar sequels, James decided to put together a writer's room. And before they even started brainstorming, he handed each writer a 1,400-page document of every little detail he'd uncovered about the world of Avatar. The detail was so granular that he even outlined the exact type of bolts used on the spaceships.
So when the follow-up The Way of Water came out a decade later, a lot of folks, myself included, suspected that no one would care about Avatar, especially when other sci-fi worlds existed alongside it. After all, by this point, we had tons of imaginative sci-fi worlds that pushed the boundaries of special effects. After Avatar, we had the MCU, the new Star Wars films, Lord of the Rings was back, Game of Thrones was back. We had tons and tons of shows that were available on the small screen and big screen that pushed the boundary. Now, are even half of these movies any good? No, of course not. What good was spectacle when everyone could produce spectacle? Avatar continues to be a behemoth, despite neither film having all that much of a nuanced or compelling plot, or even good characters, or any characters you can name. No one cares about Jake Sully, but everyone remembers those floating islands and alien dragons they ride on. This is the result of Avatar being neither a plot-driven story, nor a story whose selling point is its plot. These are two separate concepts that you don't want to confuse, because a story driven by plot is one where events derive narrative. A story whose main selling point is its plot is one where the audience goes to see the film, or show, or read the book, whatever, to see what happens in the story in terms of events.
What's in the fucking box?
The mystery, the thrills. Both of these are complex ideas with a lot of nuance, and if you find yourself going, well, people still want to see what happens in the story, such as Zoe and this and that, yes, you're right, people do. This isn't an all or nothing game, it's a nuanced discussion. There's a spectrum here. Some movies are more plot driven, some are less plot driven. Because we're going to be talking a lot about plot here, what is a plot and how is it different from a story? They often use interchangeably, but they're not the same. A story, of course, is an account of people or events, possibly fictitious, that serve to entertain. By that distinction, a plot is the sequence of events that occur in a story. So a plot is a component of the storytelling process, but it is not the entire story. It does not account for characters and does not often account for spectacle. There are other pieces here: characterization and entertainment value. A plot-driven story is a narrative that is primarily driven by the events in the story. It does allow some wiggle room, of course, where some films are mostly driven by the events of a story and others are less so. Meanwhile, a character-driven story is a story driven by character and characterization. Often, this means the story is more focused on the emotional journey the characters go on, rather than the external events of the plot. This emotional journey, in turn, drives the events that transpire, often as a vehicle to further focus on character. Most stories are a balance between plot and character, so obviously most stories are partially plot-driven and partially character-driven. Sometimes a story swings between being more character-driven to more plot-driven and vice versa, depending on how far in the script we are. The typical 3-act structure of a film often starts exactly with a more character-driven narrative before transitioning into a more plot-driven narrative, with key moments where characters take the wheel throughout. Blake Snyder's famous Save the Cat, a guidebook on writing screenplays, organizes it as such. In the setup, we introduce the story. We have an opening image that establishes the themes and ideas of the plot, but then we transition right into the character. We see what their life is like, outside of work, at play, at home, etc. We find out what they want and what they need in order to become better people, and how these two conflicts, the want and need, might intersect, overlap, or contradict each other. Around 23% into the script, we enter into Act 2 with some event that inverses the main character's world, causes conflict, turns things on its head. From there, we enter into more plot-driven narratives, enacting the fun and games that audiences kind of came to the film expecting. At the midpoint, we have a transition. The bad guys start closing in to some extent. This culminates in the all is lost moment, the dark night of the soul, where the plot and characters both in turn feel at their lowest. The external conflict is pushing against the main characters, and the main character might be struggling internally against some internal problem. Perhaps their wants and needs are farther away than they could ever hope to have them. Or perhaps they got what they wanted, but in turn lost what they needed. And in this sense, we transition into Act 3, at 77% of the way through the script, where we have the confrontations. We have the gathering of the team, the making of the plans, the executing of the plans, the surprise in the high tower, the final confrontation with the antagonists, the deep emotional dig down into the heart, and finally an execution of something that works. If something went south before, now it goes north. And we close on an image that encapsulates the entire point of the narrative. In Blake Snyder's traditional structure, we have moments of character and moments of external plot that intersect and satisfyingly conclude. I think a very explicit example of this are the MCU films, where we are introduced to the character and their struggles in Act 1, before transitioning to the core external conflict in Acts 2 and 3, with key character moments anchoring plot and character together, kind of fusing the two. For example, Captain America Winter Soldier. Act 1 is character-driven, with Cap feeling disconnected from the present day, anchored to his own past, finding that things are out of sync with what he remembers, seeing the government is not what he thought it once was, and the beliefs he once held true no longer apply in the modern era. But the plot comes in with the mysterious Hydra conspiracy and the existence of the Winter Soldier. The investigation plot drives the narrative in Acts 2 into 3. What Cap wants is to find some semblance of the world he left behind in the modern day. What Cap needs, though, is to bring those sensibilities to the modern era. And these both are intersecting but interconnected conflicts. But it's the conflict Cap feels both towards his own loss of the old world, and the conflict he has with the government is anchored by Bucky, serving as a commonality between both the events of the external plot and the internal character conflicts. In this sense, conflict drives narrative, but not all conflict is plot. Character-driven stories often tie external plot so closely to character conflicts, it's impossible to separate the two. For example, A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's a fantasy novel about a young wizard named Ged, who conjures a shadowy entity during his studies, accidentally, while essentially trying to just show off to his peers. Ambition and pride drive us to this point, not external conflict, and from here, the external conflict of the story becomes that of Ged trying to stop this entity, now under the moniker Sparrowhawk. He's trying to restrict the damages caused by his actions, and the resolution is accepting that this shadow is an aspect of himself. External conflict resolved purely by internal growth. Persona 4 fans probably recognize this plot structure very well. Other times, stories defy this convention by doing the reverse save the cat structure. Neon Genesis Evangelion, for example, starts as a plot-driven series, with the angel invasion driving conflict. The first half of the show is what you would normally associate with Act 2's fun and games, the fun section of the plot, the thing you came to see, action, adventure. However, while characters are established and developed, the early episodes decentralize character conflicts in favor of them addressing the external conflicts. Along the way, we see the beginnings of characterization conflicts here. We learn what the characters want and need, but they don't play into the plot just yet. However, in the second half of Evangelion, the story shifts. The character conflicts that were on the margins up until now take center stage. The angels become vehicles through which we can explore characterization, with them being emotionally tested or even mentally invaded. The final angel, Kaoru, is entirely an exercise in Shinji's characterization coming into play in the plot. It gets to the point where the entire ending just abandons the external plot altogether to focus entirely on the internal journey of our characters. And both of these work, but there's a reason why Evangelion remains controversial even to this day. It's inverted story driving structure. But there's a third kind of story people don't consider: spectacle-driven stories. Some stories are driven not by character or by events, but by the feeling you get when seeing something spectacular. The feeling they inspire in the audience is what drives narrative. Events and character writing are secondary to communicating a feeling, and usually that feeling is excitement or thrill. And no, this isn't just me saying how movies make you feel is more important than the plot, nor is it me saying that spectacle or feeling are particularly intellectual or sophisticated concepts. In this case especially, they're not. For example, Friday the 13th, the intellectual powerhouse, is a spectacle-driven story because the plot and characters are a vehicle to get us to the various kills. The tension and release of adrenaline is the core drive of the story. Likewise, a film like Eraserhead has barely a plot to speak of at all, or characters for that matter. Same with Tetsuo the Iron Man. Rather, what drives the plot is the creeping feelings of disconnect we get from either Lynch's nightmare world or the miracle of seeing a man turn into metal. Tetsuo the Iron Man is kind of a weird movie. I don't even know if it has a cohesive plot, or characters for that matter. As mentioned before, most films are an interplay between these three components. Both the MCU and Evangelion have intense moments of spectacle, but they're often in service of the plot and characters. When Shinji fights the Overtaken, Eva Unit 3 for example, it's an unforgettable sequence, it's incredible. But the gore and violence is only meaningful because it resolves the episode's plot and is a key moment in Shinji's increasing feelings of anxiety and isolation. Because, his father has the dummy plug system overtake his Eva and forces him to attack a machine piloted by someone who we know is his best friend. But he doesn't know that. He just knows it's the person he's harming. And the dramatic irony and tension elevate the sequence to be more impactful than it would be ordinarily if it was just another angel. Eva Unit 1 ripping Unit 3 apart is unlike Jason killing some teenagers in his story. The latter is far more superficial. Jason whacks a teen against a tree in a sleeping bag, okay, whatever. One doesn't carry with it the weight of character loss, like Unit 1's assault on Toji does. There are, of course, many variations of spectacle. One form of spectacle is comedy. A comedy's plot is often secondary to the number of gags they can pull off. Character and spectacle here drives comedy. And sometimes, comedy can transition into horror, as seen in Barton Fink, where Barton, ironically, proclaims he is a voice for the common man, while ignoring his neighbor Charlie's stories. This turns out horrific when it turns out Charlie is a maniac. Barton Fink is a character-driven story with very little spectacle. But the one spectacle it offers? Iconic cinema. Sometimes spectacle is glacial. Russian films like Solaris, Stalker, and Come and See linger in slowness, forcing you to gaze at scenes where little happens. Because nothing is driving you onward through plot, you are forced to absorb setting and visuals. And these visuals can be hypnotic, full of gravity, even sometimes deeply disturbing. If you asked me to recall Come and See's plot, I'd struggle, but I will never forget the images in that film. Solaris was later remade with much of the lingering omitted. It was a more tightly written remake, and a lot of people don't like it. Because despite being the same plot, in fact, tighter and more clearly communicated, it's not as effective without the slow, lingering shots that keep you set in one place. The greatest works of fiction balance these three pillars in different configurations, some more than the other. It's not about what they do more, but rather how it works out and what intentionality they're trying to do with these three pillars of storytelling. I think a great way to think of it is by comparing Lord of the Rings original novels by J.R.R. Tolkien to the film adaptations by Peter Jackson. The original novels are far more character-driven than plot-driven. Characters just talk, they wander around, they stop to have dinner, they stop to sing a song, they stop to eat and talk and rest, etc. There's deep emotional bonds between figures where you see grown men hug and cry and express deep mourning when someone is lost. While there is a plot that does drive narrative and it is powerful, it's a very leisurely novel to read. The Battle of Helm's Deep is built up to, but the battle itself is brief relative to page count. There's more time describing the food at Rivendell's feasts than there is the clashing of spears and shields of orcs. This is not the case for the films, which has intense, driving action, incredible spectacle. It also has a lot of great epic war scenes and battles that were briefly described in the novel. And while there is still immense characterization, there is not as much of a focus on characterization in terms of sheer page count. Tolkien cared more about the humanity within combat, whereas Peter Jackson balances humanity with visual storytelling to build tension. And both do it masterfully. But the approach is still different. One's not necessarily better than the other, they're just different approaches to the same core ideas. But Tolkien's focus is ultimately on crafting a world. One that you could feel like you could realistically slip into and live in. Especially the Shire, it's very casual. Much like James Cameron's Avatar. I'm not saying Lord of the Rings is as good as Avatar, that would be ridiculous, but Middle-earth and Pandora are both given a lot of development in the works. However, because Tolkien's characters are so richly developed and so superior in their writing, the world building becomes one aspect of the story, rather than the sole pillar. On the other hand, Jackson's Middle-earth is more plot-driven, which allows us to experience Middle-earth far more effectively through the external events that transpire. In both cases, spectacle of the world becomes one component of it. In this sense, world-driven stories often fall into spectacle. The plot and characters are vehicles to bring us to more aspects of the world, but it's a smoother process that the plot and characters work. In either event, though, what you really want to do is slip into this world that elicits a feeling in the audience. One of familiarity, one of maybe a utopian paradise, or horror, potentially. A great example of a work that really doesn't have much in the way of plotting, it's The Big Lebowski. Big Lebowski has a plot that weaves a ton of webs that goes nowhere. Nothing really gets wrapped up, and in fact, the film gradually undermines the conflict it builds up over the course of the film. This, of course, works because the film is the sort of absurdist story about a dude who gets dragged into what feels like 15 different movie plots, each subplot feeling that comes from a different genre of film. While all the dude wants is just a new rug to tie his room together. He's just vibing as stuff around him goes mental. And what holds it all together are two characters who seem divided from the rest of the weirdness. The dude and Walter, John Goodman's character. The rest of the movie is just a showcase of increasingly bizarre characters showing up for a scene or two and then nothing. Pure character-driven comedy with the pretenses of a plot that ultimately doesn't matter. But these films are the exceptions ultimately. Even the Coen brothers struggle to recapture the same absurdist vibe in their later films. Hail Caesar, I think, tries to be a Hollywood Lebowski, and it fails because it's just missing the sauce. I couldn't even tell you what that sauce is. It's not one thing, it's several things it does right in the right doses. It's hard to recapture. So unless you're a master of storytelling, you may want to have a balance of plot, character, and spectacle, as opposed to over-relying on one. That being said, sometimes you can completely forego plot and it works. Lebowski is an example of that. Tetsuo the Iron Man is an example of that. Eraserhead's an example of that. But you're probably not making Eraserhead. In theory, the perfect story balances plot, character, and spectacle perfectly. And if there is a balance to get, you get a sense that something is right. If there isn't, you can sometimes see weaknesses in the story. But the weaknesses are often the result of certain components not being enough. However, it's easy to point out when the plot doesn't work or is presented in a way that's not natural, uncommon, or potentially contrived. Most YouTube critics can point to stories where the plot is either weak, inconsistent, or full of contrivances. But sometimes the plot being structured well doesn't make anything better. And people still blame the plot when the actual issue may be spectacle or characterization. And other times, the plot can suck, but play no role in why people like the story. And these inconsistencies mean that when examining a story, you have to be flexible with how you criticize it. Take, for example, Star Wars. Many Star Wars films have a perfectly well-structured plot that adheres to traditional structure, time-honored structure. George Lucas very clearly draws from the hero's journey, and later storytellers copy Lucas's notes to do the same effect. And it works on paper. So why do so many people not like Star Wars sequels all that much? The Force Awakens, for example, is formulaic to a fault, adhering to all the main beats of storytelling that you saw in Joseph Campbell's work, that George Lucas honored. But people are still very negative at the film, and they think it's the plot that's the problem, but really, it's a few different things. The big thing, though, is world building and characterization. Those two components are weak, and as a result, the formulaic plot isn't enough to anchor the story together. First, world building, because yes, even an established world like Star Wars, at every step needs world building. After all, Star Wars is another one of those stories that got people's attention, not because it has particularly great characters or a plot, but because the world was so complex and so fantastical that it drew people in. For years, one reason the prequels are well liked by a certain generation years later is partially because of that world building. It's not character writing. The character writing is sometimes absurd.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Some of the lines of dialogue are terrible, but the world building and lore is so intricate and so richly developed that it still draws people in regardless of these shortcomings. The Disney era saw the end of the original expanded universe, which meant a ton of world building was being tossed out, replaced by a vaguely defined conflict between the First Order and Resistance. But in that first film, we don't know who these two groups really are. We have a vague idea, but nothing concrete. The plot of the film is essentially a fetch quest that turns into a stop the big superweapon quest. In effect, it's the same plot structure as A New Hope, the first film. In A New Hope, a young hero named Luke on a desert planet encounters two droids looking for a princess and goes on a mission to save her. And they end up learning the Empire has a Death Star, a giant superweapon that can blow up planets, and the film ends with them blowing up said superweapon. In The Force Awakens, a young hero named Rey on a desert planet encounters a droid and a escaped stormtrooper who has a map to Luke Skywalker, so she goes to bring the map to the Resistance, and they learn about Starkiller Base, a giant superweapon that can blow up solar systems, and the film ends with them blowing it up. It's the same plot. So if they have the same plot, that means they must both be equally good, right? Right? J.J. Abrams is known for his plot-driven mystery box stories. Stories where the mystery of what will happen next drives action over characterization or even everything else. The idea that withholding from giving answers carries you through narrative from plot beat to plot beat.
I find myself drawn to infinite possibility and that sense of potential, and I realize that mystery is the catalyst for imagination. Now, it's not the most groundbreaking idea, but when I started to think that maybe there are times when mystery is more important than knowledge, I started getting interested in this.
But the problem is with Force Awakens, none of the mysteries that Abrams sets up are resolved in the film, nor do they actually matter with the resolution of the film. The mysteries are ultimately unimportant to the plot of this individual film. It doesn't really matter where Luke is or what he was doing in The Force Awakens, because the goal of the film is to save a map to get to where Luke is. The MacGuffin is not Luke, it's the way to find Luke. Luke is not the direct conflict. It's also ultimately unimportant in The Force Awakens who Rey's parents are, because the conflict is not who they are, but will they come back to Jakku? Should Rey wait for her parents? That's the big conflict of the story. But even then, that itself is kind of unrelated, because all that really does is anchors Rey to the planet of Jakku for a bit before the actual plot kicks in Act 2. Also, it's unimportant who Snoke is, because Snoke isn't a factor. He just is a corrupting presence in Kylo Ren's life, and drives Kylo Ren to do bad. None of the mysteries Abrams sets up need to be resolved in this film, nor do they actually drive the plot of what's happening, because they're disconnected, and that's a big problem. This disconnect results in the plot feeling like it's working on multiple levels, but these levels never intersect. It's not that the plot is poorly structured, but rather the driver of the plot is disconnected from the events taking place. Because The Force Awakens is a story set in a pre-established world that experiences a time skip, it isn't immediately clear how things have meaningfully shifted since we last saw this world in the original trilogy. It immediately forces people to go, wait, how did we get here? That takes you out of the conflict in a way the original film didn't by being the first introduction to this world. It slides you in the middle of a conflict you can figure out. This one, not so much, because we have prior information that we're trying to connect to this. But the problem is in The Force Awakens, the spectacle is familiar. We've seen it before. We've already seen droids, we've already seen the giant superweapon, and we've already seen the lightsaber fights. It doesn't hit as hard when it's just a pale reflection of what we saw before. And more problematic is how the characters just don't land. I'm not saying necessarily that Star Wars had great characters, a lot of them were stock, but they were at least compelling. Finn is honestly the most interesting of all the characters introduced in The Force Awakens. He's an ex-stormtrooper who's on the run before finding something worth fighting for. That concept works and only gets diminished in each subsequent film. I think Kylo Ren's best stuff is later on, but even that first film, you get someone who wants to be this Dark Lord like Vader, like his grandfather. He falls short of being a villain and is born into a family of heroes. And that conflict, that's interesting stuff, even though it doesn't really play directly into the conflict of the film outside of the scene where he kills Han Solo. But the big problem is that Finn and Kylo Ren are not the main characters. They're supporting characters in Rey's story. A lot of people will just point to Rey and call her a Mary Sue, but I don't really think that's really it. Aside from the mind control scene, nothing she does is particularly out of line for other Star Wars protagonists thus far. And besides, that same year, we had Jurassic World come out, a movie that I think does have a Mary Sue, in the form of Chris Pratt's mind-controlled, dinosaur-controlling hero, who could just solve all problems by waving his hands in front of his face. Unlike Rey, Chris Pratt does dilute the drama and tension of every scene he's in. But the problem is not that Rey's a Mary Sue. The problem is she's just basic and boring. There's not a whole lot to her. She's a scrapper on a desert planet, but doesn't act like a scrapper. It's shown she's had to fight to survive on this desert planet, yet her fighting style is formal, as opposed to the brutal, frantic struggle you'd expect. The environment that created her doesn't seem to have any impact on her personality, appearance, or anything. She doesn't even use the bow staff that she gets after her initial fight on Jakku. The environment no longer influences Rey moving into Act 2. There's a disconnect there. If Rey were a scrappy gremlin with a lot of tinkered weapons crafted from Imperial wreckage, and that tied into how she resolved the plot at the end of the film, I think few people would care if Force Awakens' plot was derivative, because Rey herself would not feel just as derivative. Instead, she's basically a female Luke Skywalker, without any of the elements of characterization that made Luke compelling. The problem isn't that Rey's overpowered, she's actually fairly weak in the vast scheme of accomplishments protagonists in Star Wars have accomplished. She doesn't take down a space station all by herself like Anakin, nor does she stop the Death Star single-handedly like Luke does. It's actually a more experienced pilot who takes down Starkiller Base on his own. No, Rey's problem is she's just derivative. It's that she doesn't bring anything new to the table. And because of that, the plot, which also brings nothing to the table, and the spectacle, which also brings nothing to the table, falter. It's not merely plot that's the problem, but a perfectly fine plot becomes frustrating when the other pillars of storytelling do not stand alongside it. In a lot of ways, Ray is Jake Sully. Both bring nothing to the table. Both are shockingly skilled despite their minimal experience on an alien world. And both are boring because they bring nothing new to the table. So why is one mostly forgotten and one deeply reviled? Maybe it's to do with the fact that fewer people care about what happens in Avatar versus Star Wars. Or it's sexism, who really knows? Watching Jake mount that big alien dragon thing. Okay, from a plot and characterization standpoint, it's pretty unfulfilling. Much like Rey and her mind control force powers, there's no reason Jake should be able to capture the biggest alien dragon thing when none of the other Na'vi can do it. He feels kind of like a Mary Sue, in fact more like a Mary Sue than anything Rey ever does. Because unlike Rey, who does something that almost every Jedi can do at some point with some training, Jake Sully has done something that's remarkable even by the standards of the Na'vi, who've had decades of training to do this more than he has. But you don't care necessarily, because the spectacle is something you haven't seen before. Because it's visually impressive, when watching the film, you don't really think, well, this is kind of dumb, isn't it? If you're shown something unique, you can forgive bad characterization. This is why despite each Avatar film having essentially the same plot, I'm gonna guess Ash and Fire does too, I'm sure that won't age badly, you're left seeing something distinct. Again, the first one focuses on the air tribe, with flying beasts and battles in the sky. The second focuses on the ocean, and the third focuses on volcanic ash and fire. All of it ultimately serves one core point, to show you something each time you hadn't seen before, taking a familiar element and a familiar world and showing you it from a new angle. And the sequels, for Star Wars, outside The Last Jedi, didn't do that. Though some people might argue The Last Jedi showed them too much they hadn't seen before, and that bothered them. But again, I digress. But then there are films that sell you on the concept based on the plot, versus those who don't. No one watches Godzilla films, for example, for the plot. The plot's not important, except for Godzilla -1. That one is a good plot. But you do watch it for the spectacle of seeing Godzilla fighting a new kaiju. Throughout the MCU and other superhero films, there is a balance of plot and character, but the selling point is ultimately the spectacle of the combat and, if you like the hero, seeing a new adventure your hero can go on. It's not the specific events of the plot that drive you to the theater, but rather seeing Spider-Man, seeing Batman, seeing Superman. What they're doing? That's less important than seeing your hero in action. But what films are selling you based on the plot? Those are films like, say, Longlegs, a movie that teased for some time this haunting, enigmatic mystery, or Halloween Ends, which promised a resolution on the long gestating conflict between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers, and both disappointed. What I'm ultimately saying is that these are the films you watch because you want to see the story unfold. Often, films that lean more heavily into their respective genre and tropes are the ones that sell you on the plot to one extent or another, while others, either long-running franchises, for example, centered on specific characters, a specific world, or genre fare that tries to offer the next thing you've never seen before. They focus on character or spectacle to sell you on the plot. Avatar never sold its audience on its plot. Rather, the core appeal is and always was being transported to a world unlike any you've seen before. Pandora is its own spectacle. The still impressive CG animation, which even over a decade later has few if any peers, is a spectacle, especially in the IMAX theaters. That's why those films always sell out in IMAX, and really nothing else does. I mean, Dune does, but that's another point. And so then the question becomes, what's more important? What people come to see about in the film, or what the film presents to the audience? Audience expectations or artistic achievement. In perfect cases, they're one and the same. No one in the world comes to a Friday the 13th film expecting Shakespeare, but a lot of people will go to an MCU film, think the film is awesome in the theater, and then reevaluate it afterwards. They went to see the characters they love and got that, but as the film sits with them, issues with spectacle or plot start to take them out of their love of the film. The problem is that entertainment is a balancing act of creating compelling plot and satisfying your audience's expectations. As a critic, I tend to weigh the artistic intention as the most important thing. What did the artist try to do? How did they succeed? What got in their way of achieving their goals? This, that, and the other. But audience expectation is valuable too. It's why a film like Longlegs, despite achieving this weird, surreal horror that Osgood Perkins intended, ultimately feels underwhelming. Because it isn't exactly the type of film that the marketing team indicated it was. You know, it's funny, when I think about Halloween Ends or Longlegs, which are good films that just didn't provide audiences what they were promised, I think about a scene from the movie Barton Fink. The whole movie, Barton is writing a wrestling script for a studio. It's a simple B picture, but instead he delivers this soul-searching, thoughtful, introspective, character-driven film, and the executive hates it because it's not what he asked for.
This is a wrestling picture. The audience wants to see action, adventure, wrestling, and plenty of it. They don't want to see a guy wrestling with his soul.
And I just keep thinking, imagine if you went to go see like Hajime no Ippo, an anime like that, and instead you got navel gazing. I guess kind of like The Wrestler. You'd be disappointed. No matter how good that material is, you will walk away upset because it's not what you thought it would be.
There's plenty of poetry right inside that ring, Think.
The reason Avatar remains such a relevant film is because no one has ever attempted to do what James Cameron did in that first film. And likewise, the reason Star Wars feels like it's stumbling onward is because few directors, outside of those working on Andor, choose to move beyond what George Lucas did in that first trilogy. They don't show us anything new in the familiar. Spectacle requires innovation, and to wow audiences, increasingly, films choose not to innovate. They choose the familiar. So stories that should be driven by spectacle leave you cold because you've seen it before. The spectacle isn't fresh. Doesn't matter if the plot and characters suck, which they do, because Avatar remains relevant because of its visual technique, because Cameron remains the top of the game in that regard. And it's not the effects guys' fault for this either, because the studios force effects crews to work tirelessly, revising what they make over and over again, and having to toss everything out over and over again, resulting in lackluster results and inflated budgets. Meanwhile, Godzilla Minus One, specific vision, much less money, better looking effects. Cameron grew up on Roger Corman Productions. He figured out how to make spaceships for Corman using McDonald's styrofoam containers painted chrome. He created a room of endless military pods and aliens because he used a basic mirror trick. There's only like 6 pods in this shot. The rest, it's all just mirrors, making it look like they're more. Taking very little, with very deliberate filming techniques, making it look massive. He took something cheap and made it look massive. Cameron is meticulous and knows what he wants when he starts, and gets it. Movies like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania look cheaper than Avatar because of this tossing everything out mentality that studios have. We'll fix it in post, and not have a deliberate idea of what we want to do early on. As a result, you get these rushed ideas and rushed components where the background feels disconnected from the foreground, where characters are floating in CGI wastelands as opposed to existing in CGI-rendered realities. If Hollywood is going to deliver spectacle, it needs to stop appealing to nostalgia and offer craftsmen the chance to produce something extraordinary. Or, get better scripts that prioritize plot, character, and spectacle in even amounts. There are thousands of screenwriters in Hollywood producing spec scripts that are critically acclaimed, but never get purchased by big studios because studios increasingly refuse to take a risk on untested talent. But some of the best scripts of the decade, from The Menu to Promising Young Women, were based on spec scripts written by screenwriters, not requested by producers.
When I eat your food, it tastes like it was made with no love.
Oh, this is ridiculous. We always cook with love, don't we?
Then you're kidding yourself.
If Hollywood hopes to survive in an increasingly competitive landscape, it needs to innovate. Unfortunately, by all accounts, with the big studios anyway, they are not.
I don't guess this means much to you.
Hell yeah, I could tell you some stories.
And that's the point, that we all have stories.